everybody, and welcome to EBM. My name is Craig McCoy. For those of you who haven't met, I'm privileged to be the chair of London HR Connection. Welcome to you all, and I'm sure we'll have a great evening here at EBM. And I'm privileged to introduce to you David D'Souza on my left. David is the head of the CIPD London region. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about a fascinating topic of robots and automation, and whether or not we're all actually destined to be replaced by robots, which is quite an interesting thought, isn't it? David's a regular speaker on the topic. He has senior HR pedigree, having done many senior HR roles in financial services, including Metro Bank, I believe. He's going to talk about obviously automation and ethics associated with automation. So at this point, I'll hand over to David.
Can everyone hear me without a microphone? Is that because the microphone plus the piano is almost too tempting? Because I can say I haven't got any slides, so this feels overkill. That really feels like overkill for what I plan to talk about tonight. My name is David D'Souza. I'm head of London for the CIPD, and increasingly what we're focusing on at the CIPD is the future of work. And within that kind of concept of the future of work is what does the future workforce look like, and actually within that is wrapped up is kind of actually what can artificial intelligence do for us, what can coding do for us, how different will the world look in 5 to 10 years time. And 5 to 10 years time is probably the world's trickiest number, because it's just far enough away for you to ignore it. So every HR team will probably have 2020, that will kind of be an interesting kind of place to be. But there's a wonderful concept in behavioural science called hyperbolic discounting. And hyperbolic discounting is the reason why we're really bad at saving in our pensions, and we're really bad at dieting. And that's because spending the money now seems a lot more fun, and we give it kind of a slightly too much kind of value over the long term, and also having that bun now, having that cake now, it's kind of like, well, I can get it back at some point in the future. And when we think about the future of work, we tend to discount actually what that future may be looking like versus what we're doing now. So Siobhan Sheridan at the NSPCC, who's the HR dealer, has got a lovely turn of phrase about long-term issues, which she calls sleepwalking towards them. And I actually genuinely think automation is an issue that we're potentially sleepwalking towards, which is that we can all see it coming, and we all kind of read the articles, and we see it popping out. But what we're not genuinely doing is going, so what does that mean in the future? Because it seems theoretical. So there are a couple of things I want to do tonight. One thing I want to do is tell a humiliating story about myself, so that when you feel a bit sorry for me, but also we have an affinity. And secondly, I wanted to invite questions as we go along. So if anything seems completely implausible, and you go, but that would never happen, just stick your hand up and just kind of go, but that would never happen. So I was speaking on a Monday at a NUM conference. And if no one's been to a NUM conference, it's where you kind of have loose conversations around defined subjects. And I was lined up to talk about artificial intelligence and algorithms and how it impacts recruitment. And I sat down in a room to speak about it, and I kicked off. And I probably spoke for about 5 minutes, and then an interesting conversation kicked off around it. And then probably about 10 minutes in, and I thought the audience was a bit thrown on the ground, someone popped their head around the corner and said, "You're not in this room, you're next door." And then the person at the other end of the table went, "Yeah, actually I was supposed to be leading this workshop." And that was more embarrassing. So take pity on me. I'm in the right room tonight, and it's a glorious setting. But as we go along, please fill it out with your questions, because I don't want you to sit there for 40 minutes going, actually this is rubbish, I don't believe it. Let's have the conversation whilst we're going. Because actually it's that context of the day-to-day that's really important. So we're sitting here in a week where a very complex game that's mainly played in Asia has seen some fantastic headlines, which is that Google's algorithms, Google's computing is beating humans at a game that people said wouldn't happen. In the same way that if you go back 10 to 15 years, humans were always going to be able to master chess in a way that a computer couldn't. But then Kasparov was beaten. And now we're looking at a very complex game where someone's been beaten. But the wonderful thing is, or the scary thing is, and they're the two lenses that you can apply to some of this, If you read the news coverage locally, because it's not a game that I understand very closely, what's impressive isn't that the computers won, it's the level of creativity that the computers show. It's what was actually described by one commentator as genuine artistry in that game. And that is the difference now between, I guess, the conversation that, I will be honest with you, the conversation we'll have tonight, some people will go, yeah, but that's what they said about the typing pool in the 1970s, and that didn't lead to everything changing. It's different now. You can't speak to any top level of economist, and I've spoken to a lot of them about this subject, who can articulate what happens to a workforce that potentially erodes as quickly as ours might with automation. It just hasn't happened. The Industrial Revolution didn't do it. That was kind of creating opportunity. What we're talking about here is potentially reducing the aggregate workforce that's needed, potentially in the UK, because we're a very advanced economy, but also worldwide. And what do you do with groups of people that are basically made redundant? And my favourite go-to for this, and not many of you work in this industry, so it's a nice neutral one, so you don't have to worry about it. Does anyone here deal with long-distance lorry drivers in the United States? Okay, so I'm in a safe position talking about this. There are about 1.6 million long-distance lorry drivers in the United States, between 1.6 and 1.7 million. As you can imagine, for long-distance lorry drivers, they don't have a particularly transferable set of skills. They aren't sitting there going, well, if this doesn't work out, I'll just become an accountant. They are pretty good at driving long distances in lorries. That's kind of what they do. Google is obviously experimenting now, as are Tesla, with driverless technology. We are testing on the roads in this country already driverless lorries. Within the next 3 to 4 years, why would you have something driving from one place to another that needs to rest? Why would you have something driving from one place to another that's prone to driver error? So Google had quite recently and quite prominently in the press their first accident of a driverless vehicle that was the vehicle's fault. And everyone jumped on it and went, oh, these shouldn't be allowed on the roads. It had done 1.5 billion miles at that point. You're talking about cars that have driven huge distances without an accident. Actually, the hardest thing to get a driverless car to do is to understand how bad we are at driving and compensate for that. It's things like, how do you teach a car to force its way onto a clogged motorway is the challenge, because Google's programmed them to be safe. So they reach the edge of the motorway and they just stop, because it looks really tricky and the gaps aren't big enough because we're not leaving them. You need to teach them that element of humanity, but we can do that. So the challenge, I guess, is what do you do with 1.6 million redundant people? You think about the society of the US, which doesn't have a fantastic record in terms of welfare and supporting people out of work. That's a huge societal shift. That's not just a shift that impacts companies, that's a shift that impacts societies and communities. And at the CIPD, our focus is on championing better work and working lives. And that's a breadth beyond what's just happening in organisations, but actually what happens in society. And we're at a tipping point now that we're ignoring and we don't quite understand, because we've got choices that we can make now that are different around the way that we interact and we use technology that we're not quite stepping up to because we don't realise. So, what does it look like in the average company? It's probably a good question, but also what does it look like for HR? So there have been some recent studies that have been done, and I'm happy if anyone wants me to kind of send detail on afterwards. And some of them are really good and some of them are really, really bad. So what's happening, as with any kind of media subject, is that people are rushing to the most dramatic conclusion that they can come to. So it started off with people going, about 20% of jobs might be automated by 2050. And now it's kind of a race to the bottom with people going, every job's going to be automated by Wednesday. It's going to, they're all gone, they're all gone. And the truth probably lies somewhere in between. But Andy Haldane at the Bank of England, who aren't prone to scaring people unnecessarily, put a figure on the impact of jobs being about 50% of jobs being at risk over the next 15 to 20 years. So I guess we've got some different stakeholders in the room. Who still expects to be in work in 15 to 20 years? Hands up. Okay, so this impacts you. Who falls in, who didn't put their hand up and has children? Impacts you. Who doesn't care about either of those things and is just here because there's some free wine? Okay, no hands. Okay, so we're all stakeholders in this in kind of different ways. And I have a 6-year-old daughter. And she's great, but I don't know what to teach her, and I don't know what job she'll do when she grows up, and I don't actually know what's going to be left. So if you look at, there was a really interesting study that came out of Oxford that looked at the complexity of roles and the likelihood of automation over time. And on the bottom end is the stuff that you would kind of expect to see, which is kind of easily replicable tasks. So the kind of stuff we've already got machines doing, so it might be on an assembly line, it might be Amazon's now got 10 factories in the US that are run purely on automated means by goods being picked and kind of sent out for delivery by robots. So you kind of got that at that end. But what's more scary is that you get to the middle spot and it's not actually low-end jobs. They're the things that have traditionally been the professions. So you suddenly start seeing things like lawyers popping up. And you go, well actually, yeah, if comparing a contract is essentially the science of analysing this, analysing that, looking for the differences, understanding what might contradict, that can easily be automated. So you look at kind of the entry level for lawyers, so you look at kind of paralegals and you kind of think about the career path. You think, what if that start of the career path doesn't exist anymore? So I did this talk, so I will confess that occasionally I'm unnecessarily, unintentionally crass. So I did a talk similar to this for a large tech company. And someone came up afterwards and said, this is really fascinating because my job's being made redundant due to automation. So it's kind of like, I was talking about it in a theoretical way, this is coming. She was like, this is happening now, I've got about 6 months, and I'm doing basic HR admin now, and I'd assume that I would do HR admin for a few years, then I'll become an HR advisor, then I'll become an HR manager, and then an HR business partner, and that's how my career would go, until it's just been chopped off here. I don't know where to go. I'm not ready for the next step up, but actually they don't even need this tier within the organisation anymore. So I have a daughter who's 6 years old, so I'll come back to her. She's called Olwyn, so it's a Welsh name, so I'm still bitter about the weekend for anyone who's English. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and George North's foot wasn't in touch for anyone who watched the game. It was a false and horrible thing. But she's 6 years old, and someone asked me when I was talking about this recently, does she need to learn how to write? And I thought that's a really compelling question about future skills. Does she need to learn how to write? Because Mark Zuckerberg, who heads up Facebook and is quite good on the tech stuff, says that within 10 to 15 years you'll be able to update your Facebook profile just by thinking about it. So there's a couple of scary things there. In 15 years we'll still have Facebook, according to Mark Zuckerberg. And I was hoping that would fall by the wayside so I don't have to worry about whether not liking someone's birthday is a thing. But the other thing is skills are fundamentally changing. And in HR, we need to work out how we respond to that change. So the Ordnance Survey did a fascinating survey of skills that people think are dying out. And on that, you had things like darning socks, you had using an old-fashioned map, you actually had using the index of a book. Like, that was a skill that's going to die out. And then they asked people, so 1,000 people asked that, and then they asked the same 1,000 people, what do you think should be the response to this? And 80% of people said they should become compulsory in schools. So our response to a world that no longer needs you to be able to darn socks is to make it compulsory within the education system. It's a really scary place, but that's how we think, because actually we like to think about the world staying static, and we like to think about the career paths we had being the ones that we will share in the future. And they won't. They'll be wholly different. So there's a factory in Japan, there's 3 actually, same organisation, that a couple of weeks ago announced its first experiment, pilot, into automating managers. So using machine learning and AI, artificial intelligence, to run their factories. Not to just shift stuff about, but to decide what needed to be shifted, who to employ, what orders to give people. So you're kind of coming to a terminal, yeah, or you're having it sent to you to tell you what to do. You're no longer going to see your manager what to do. 8% improvement in productivity in those factories. So I guess the question that was posed, I think, for tonight was, are robots the employees of the future? The question is probably, actually, to a degree, are robots the employers of the future? The question is, how high and how far can this go? So you have a conversation with people, and I'm going to challenge you as an audience here tonight. Whenever I have this conversation with people, and it happened again on Monday with a group of probably about 20 or 30 recruiters, everyone thinks that their job will be the last to go. Because everyone likes to think of themselves as unique. They go, but a machine can never replace that bit. Well, actually, they kind of test for years in terms of whether machines could replace humans, which is called the Turing test. And the Turing test was an interaction between a person and a machine that was producing responses. And the idea was that the machine could never have a conversation in the way a human could. And that was the test for years and years and years. Classic test. About 18 months ago, a machine passed the Turing test for the first time. So when you're interacting with it, if you can't see the person, you can't tell whether it's a person or whether it's a machine. That fundamentally changes actually what can be done. Facebook have got a pilot concierge service in the US, which is powered by artificial intelligence. So you write and you go, I'd like dinner here, and can you arrange my holiday? And it's kind of a PA service. Powered by artificial intelligence, but it also has a backup of people if for some reason you can't deal with the queries. It's seamless for the end user because you can't tell what's a person and what's the artificial intelligence. There's a company out in Japan that's started, they've got about 20% of the CEO's duties have now been automated. They're kind of looking at the decision-making process and what sits in the duties of a senior team member, how you analyse data, what calls you make off the back of that. And they're saying, how much of this could we actually do better if we remove the human element? We think of the human element in a really romantic way. When we think about the human element, we talk about the gut calls. So when I was with the recruitment folk on Monday, and there were about 20 or 30 of them, when I got to the right room, someone stood up and they went, the one thing it can never do is replace the fantastic calls that I've made with my gut throughout my career, where I saw the twinkle in the person's eye, and I knew that they were the person that I could hire, and they would go on and do great things. And then someone else on the other side of the room said, yeah, what about all your mistakes? Like, how often do you think about your mistakes? And what about your bias? And what about the amount of discrimination that you've placed in there? And actually, how many times have you written something off as just unlucky? And actually, how many of the 50-50 calls should have gone the other way? And you never know whether the other candidate would have been more successful. And have you ever looked through and done some really deep analysis that a computer could do almost instantly as to what are the common things that make someone successful in different working environments? And in fairness, the person who said a computer could never replace me, when, yeah, you're probably right. I like to think a computer could never replace me, but actually there's probably a lot of mistakes that I made that it couldn't do. And if you think about our own industry and the elements and the strands of it, we're at real risk. We still have some quite administratively heavy functions. We are embracing technology in a more effective way, but actually quite what that means quite often is that we're removing processes that were quite dependent on us and embedding them into the business. And the closest bit of work that we can probably still retain expertise in, and I think probably the future of HR to a degree, is our expertise in things like organisational dynamics, team dynamics. And this is it's going to sound both strategic and not strategic. The strategic coffees that you have throughout your career, where someone comes to you and they're in a very bad way, or they're at a pivotal point in their career, and you give them advice that changes the path that they're on. They decide not to resign, or they decide to resign. They decide to go somewhere else. They decide to go for that promotion. They're the things that are going to be hardest to automate. If you look at that continuum of jobs that I talked about, where you've got on this side, easy to replicate, then in the middle you've got some jobs that are probably at threat, but the professions wouldn't recognise it. At this end, the hardest to replicate job is social work. It's just the one that you really struggle to think about how a computer's going to do that as effectively. How do you create empathy? How do you create trust? They're the things that are really key, actually intense, difficult relationships. But actually we have that to play across an entire organisation. How do you create a culture of trust in an organisation? How do you get an organisation that deals effectively with conflicts? And that's something that we can use technology to aid us with and support us with, but it's probably, at the very least, buying us some time whilst we work out what else we could do. If you go back to cave paintings, which may seem, I realise I'm hopping about in time here. 20 years forward, now back to cave painting. The average working week was about 20 hours a week. If you look at Keynes's work, he thinks we should be down to, I think, about 15 hours a week now. That was kind of his projection. We're down to 15 hours a week. That would be the working week. Would be good. We're at a pivot point where actually we're probably not needed to do a lot of stuff. You could just give it to something that's automated. And we choose not to, because we choose to have more. We're living in an absolutely glorious city. It's not cheap to eat here. It's not cheap to live here. You need to do more to earn that. And we're at a really interesting point where you need to look and think about whether the quality of living that we have is consistently increasing, or whether we're just making choices that will be in a far more condensed and compact employment environment. So if you took Andy Haldane's projection of 50% of jobs over the next 15 to 20 years, and you reduce that actually by half, and you just go 25% of jobs, what does that mean in terms of social stress? Yeah, so even if it was just the bottom tier, even if you kind of look at retail and some of those retail, hospitality, and again you say, so people may say, no one said because no one's put their hands up yet, but if you look at hospitality, you might say, well, who doesn't want to be greeted by, a real person? Well, there are hotels in Japan now that operates simply with a hologram greeting you. That's the customer service you get. It's a hologram. You walk in. We've got hotels here now where you just turn up and you swipe your credit card, and that's going to be your room key as well. It's a very different model. It doesn't involve a person in the same way, but we will hold on to the belief that it requires a person up until the point that we prove that we don't need a person. And that's going to be the challenge for lots of professions. And actually we have a role within that to help people going through that transition as well. Because you will find over the next 15 to 20 years that people have committed themselves to a career and it is no longer there. And we've talked about, lots of people have talked about the change from a job for life to lots of different jobs and then potentially portfolio careers. The challenge is whether there's going to be a big enough portfolio to go around, and what that means for standards of living, what that means for employability, what that means for society as a whole. So, has everyone here seen Jurassic Park? Has anyone not seen Jurassic Park and needs a really quick rundown of what Jurassic Park's about? Because I had to do that in Greece and explaining to sorry, there was somebody. You haven't seen it. Do you know broadly what's about? Okay, that's good. I take my jacket off. This is getting like serious stuff. So, and I realise most of the room have seen it, so I'm going to do the quickest explanation of Jurassic Park I've done. A guy called John Hammond, multi-billionaire, wants to create a theme park for dinosaurs. Not for dinosaurs to go to, that would be ridiculous, but populated by dinosaurs. And he sets it up, and they clone some dinosaurs. They take it from amber. Technology works, you see, like in the film. And then he decides he wants some people to look at it before it opens. And what he brings to that island is he brings some hunters, sensible choice, big dinosaurs, quite angry. He brings a couple of anthropologists who are experts in dinosaurs, so that kind of works. Anthropology wouldn't be, they'd be experts in dinosaurs. What's the name for an expert in dinosaurs? Paleontologists. That's closer and more useful. So a couple of paleontologists onto the island, and finally he brings a rock star mathematician played by Jeff Goldblum. Now that may seem a bit left field. It's probably not the first thing you think of when you think of an island populated with dinosaurs. I need a mathematician. But Jeff Goldblum kind of plays a role throughout. It's called Dr. Ian Malcolm, that brings a level of scientific rigour but also philosophy to the proceedings. And this is where everyone else can tune in now. This is kind of like, it's about him. I'm not still doing the update. And he says a couple of really, really interesting things that are more kind of dominant in the book, but also come out in the film. And the first thing he says is, you didn't have to earn this technology, so you haven't thought about how you need to use it. And that's really important for HR as we dive into a world of algorithms and vendors telling you just press this button and you get the perfect candidate, or just do this and it'll tell you who your top performers are. But we don't actually understand what's going in the background there. Because we're in a profession that actually, let alone knowing how to code, we still have people who don't know how to use Excel. So you're kind of like, there's a huge gap in actually of trust There's a gap between what we know and what we understand and what we're doing in the technology we're utilising. And the second thing he says, which I call the Jurassic Park problem, is he says, you're too busy thinking about whether you could do it to think about whether you should do it. And that applies to almost everything that's happening in terms of technological advances currently. We are so focused on gaining competitive advantage through automation, through utilisation of technology, that we're losing sight of actually why we have that technology in the first place. And that's a real challenge for HR. That is a humdinger of a challenge for HR. Because our ability to cope with the ethical challenges of utilisation of technology isn't keeping up with technology. So Microsoft have got some really interesting kit coming out. And what that will allow you to do is effectively tell whether someone's going to break. So you'd monitor them, and you would be able to tell whether they're going to break physically or whether they're going to break mentally. Yeah, so you kind of have this ongoing health monitoring of your employees. That sounds like a great thing, doesn't it? Who thinks that sounds like a great thing? Hands up for great thing. There's some. Who thinks that sounds quite sinister? Yeah. I think I've had conversations with Microsoft about it, and they went, it's great, isn't it? Because that shows duty of care. And I'm like, whoa, because that's about privacy, that's about autonomy, that's about who controls that data and where that data goes. That's actually about your relationship with the employer. So the first time that you get a bad insurance quote back for life cover, what's the first thing you're going to think is? It's like my company's told the insurer that's been leaked out, they must know something. That just fractures the employer relationship instantly. That trust bond. Organisations are giving out Fitbits now. They go, give out your Fitbits, go into a daily challenge. Yeah, the first time a manager sits down with someone and goes, I notice you haven't done as many steps as some of the other people, and I noticed that you took 3 days off sick last month. And I'm just wondering whether if you hit your 10,000 a day, you might be more prone to, performing effectively. They're the conversations that we're on the cusp of, and they're not theoretical ones. They're happening already in the US, they're happening in some other countries, and I'm guessing they're happening here, we just haven't quite heard about it yet. And that's the ethical challenge we have. So if you look at predictive analytics, it's a really interesting science, but it's not perfect. But we're treating it as though it is, because we want it. We're in HR, and we want to prove our commercial smarts, and we want credibility, and we want to be at the forefront of technology. But there's a really good example, which is there was a kind of really high-profile study where people said you could predict who was going to get flu through an areas where there were going to be epidemics through using Google search. So you'd look at Google search, you'd look at where people were searching a lot for flu symptoms, and then you'd be able to tell, almost certainly who was going to get flu. And that kind of held for a couple of years. But what wasn't reported as much at the back end of it is that there was then a major TV program in the US, Dr. Phil, and Dr. Phil just did a segment on flu. And Google then predicted the entire country had flu. Because everyone was going, that was interesting, and they were typing in there, searching up some more information, and it was a false positive, but we're not reporting that. We're reporting all of the successes of technology as though they're Bible. Every time there's a sporting tournament, and I kind of challenge people in this room to look out for this now. Every time there's a sporting tournament, about a week afterwards, you will see in the papers the secrets of success of the winner. And within that, it will have, they use big data, they used kind of top-level quantified analysis of the athletes involved to give them the winning edge. What it doesn't tell you is that the loser also used that technology in the 3rd place, in the 4th place, in the 5th place, right down actually to some of the lowest teams. Because, believe it or not, sporting contests are sometimes won by people. And we're in this challenging environment where technology and the myth of technology is running away, but the capability is also genuinely there and outstripping us. So if you think about the challenge of working internationally, Microsoft have, does everyone use Microsoft Skype? Familiar with Skype? That's not a random thing. Skype's now got in beta 50 language translator that will kind of do live on the fly translation. Think about how that changes how you could hire and where you could hire. You can have a conversation that's instantly translated with pretty much anyone in the world. I say anyone in the world, there's more than 50 languages, but that's the direction it's going. think about how fundamentally that would change your recruitment and attraction pool and those relationships. The technology is coming, and if I think that my job is safe, just because I speak English, so that's a competitive advantage quite often, won't be the case, because actually that doesn't matter quite soon. You'll be competing genuinely internationally. So TaskRabbit and Fiverr are two good examples of websites where you can put yourself available for work and then deliver it internationally. So I might want a spreadsheet done, and I can have someone do it for me in India. They can write the macro, send it back to me, and it costs me £5. That changes the employer-employee relationship completely. So the next thing is that when I speak to organisations, quite a few of the larger ones are talking about we'll have a smaller permanent workforce. This is kind of the plan. And then we'll have people doing portfolio careers around the outside of that. So we'll draw on resource more often in a more ad hoc way. And we can do that because of technology, and we'll know who to bring in, and we'll know the skills that we need, and we'll use them for a finite amount of time. We'll get the maximum work from that. Well, that's a challenge in itself, because actually, don't we think that a degree of productivity or performance comes from the affiliation with the organisation, passion to do well for it, discretionary effort? Do you really want people working for you who, whilst they are doing that piece of work, are aware of the impending kind of end of that contract? Because that works really well for some people. That works well for most contractors. That works well for consultants. But quite a few people like to know that they're going to get their mortgage paid at the end of the month. And that's a real challenge. So it works for the organisation where you design it theoretically, but actually, what does the person look like that can't guarantee where their next job's from? What does the person look like that kind of feels more disposable? What does employee engagement, affinity, and brand values and all those things look like in that environment? It's a huge challenge. So I think, broadly speaking, it's a bit tricky. And it's tricky from a few perspectives. One of which is that hyperbolic discounting concept, which is that actually it seems a bit far off. So probably most people listen to that and they go, I hope at least you think it was a little bit interesting. There was one sentence he said towards the start that I really liked. So I kind of think it's interesting, but actually, does it really apply to me? I very much doubt anyone will go back to their organisations and go, right, okay, artificial intelligence and automation, where does that fit into our HR plan? But we should. Because if you don't start thinking about it now, it gets here before you've done the thinking about it, and that's a real issue. It's an issue because actually the welfare of the workforce is a challenge for HR. And by that I mean their emotional security, their capability, and their commitment. They're kind of the challenges that we deal with. So what does a workforce look like where it's not sure about its next job, and it's working for a series of companies that only hires them for a short time, so no one's going to pump up the money for them to go through a number of qualifications? Because why would you? You're only here for 6 months. It's a different economy. And if you have a fundamentally different economy, that's a different experience for everyone in this room. And for those of us who will still be in work in 10, 15 years' time, possibly, that's a really worrying thing. For those of us with kids, that's a really worrying thing. But for anyone with an interest actually in where society goes over the next 10 to 15 years, that's a hugely compelling challenge, but one that is primarily being ignored. There isn't much that can't be done by artificial intelligence. Care homes in Japan are supporting dementia patients by having iPads with faces on, chatting to them, giving them detail, giving them recollection, and it's working. And it feels, someone's going to go, like, that's cold, that feels like an awful thing. But I went and spoke to ACAS about this, and I had someone genuinely about halfway through just going, I'm just resigning, I may as well write, this is awful, it's horrific, it's apocalyptic. But we have a choice, because actually we're in charge of the technology, I think. So the challenge is this, and the challenge is this. I'm not looking at you specifically. Has anyone not seen the film Wall Street? And I'm not saying there's a correlation between not seeing Jurassic Park and Wall Street, but okay. Wall Street, Wall Street. Okay. Yeah, Michael Douglas, Charlie Sheen. I'll not go into detail on this one. But there's that wonderful phrase from Wall Street, which is money never sleeps. It was that concept that, whilst we're asleep, the money's still progressing and it's finding its way to where it needs to go. That almost like the economy has a life of its own that is beyond the control of people. And actually, if you look back at the financial crisis, once it reached crisis point, there were only so many things that we could do about that. It was kind of like the money's going to end up however it ends up, the banks will end up however they end up, we can intervene where we can, but actually this is bigger than us. That concept of too big to fail was also too big to control. And this isn't a pop at the financial sector because I worked in the financial sector. This is actually an observation that our connection and control of the environment has reduced over time because we've built things that are so impressive and so big and so complex. And that concept of money never sleeps is very similar to the concept now that I think we have that technology never sleeps. There's an arms race in technology where people aren't asking why, they're asking how. How do I get this better? How do I replace someone there? How do I beat someone's intuition there? How can I keep building things that are better than the tech company that's going to come after me? You know, how can I take all risk out of the employment recruitment process? I'm not saying they're bad targets, but actually what we're doing is we're also removing humanity from those processes. And we're doing it without thinking, and actually we don't have many checks and balances unless we're going to start treating that as a serious, serious heartfelt problem. And I don't think we are. I think we're seeing it as an opportunity because businesses have been centred around being more commercial. And more commercial means keeping your costs down and getting your profits up. But actually, there are people that work in those businesses, and that's the basis of our society. It's not the businesses themselves, it's the fact that we gain employment, and employment gives us living standards, and it gives us disposable income, and there's a cycle that sits within that. And we're sitting on the verge of breaking that cycle without knowing it, which is replacing the rewards for humanity by putting them into that portion. Isaac Asimov wrote I, Robot, probably around 40 or 50 years ago now. It was kind of his view of the future. And it was turned into a really bad film with Will Smith. Don't watch that one. Jurassic Park is classic. Jurassic Park and Wall Street, you should be nailing those, but I, Robot, really bad. But it's about the ethics of robotics. And there's a series of laws that robots must obey. But it's worth getting the book just to read the final chapter. And the final chapter envisions an entire world run by artificial intelligence. And this was at a time that, that wasn't a normal thing to be thinking about, but an entire world that's run by something called the machine. And the machine works out where to put resources. The machine directs people to those resources. It works out who to move from one place to another. And there's a series of seemingly blips in the running of the machine. So the machine, some accidents start to happen, no one gets injured. Some resources get sent somewhere and they shouldn't. And the conclusion they draw is that the machine has learned to such an extent that it's removing humans from that system. So it worked out there was a really poor supervisor who was making people unhappy, so it flagged up an area that meant that supervisor got transferred. It had reached that level of kind of sentience and control. We're not far off. And when I say we're not far off, that's not a naive statement, because I've told you that we've already got automated hiring coming in. So you hit an algorithm and someone goes there. But we're starting to get automated management, and up to 20% of the CEO's job and decision making can be made by a machine, or by machine learning. That's rapidly encroaching into a space where there isn't much space for people left. We can still serve in McDonald's, that's kind of cool, and we can do that service with a smile thing. But actually, he doesn't want that food quicker and more rapidly. He doesn't want that convenience. And you may end up with an economy with kind of boutique. Oh yeah, it's really traditional, you still go there and people serving. Or you may just end up with actually us being surplus. We might be professional tiers, whatever it looks like. We might be in the same situation as the lorry drivers in the US. 1.6 million of them. A couple of years ago, I was genuinely bored. I've got no idea how bored I must have been to have done this, but it was the day of the taxi strike. And so the taxis they blocked up all of central London to protest against Uber, because Uber was the bad technology that was coming to take their jobs away. And not one of them, I spent a day walking up, just talking to cabbies, just going, because I thought it was a really interesting one for me. Like, should we be keeping the cabbies in jobs? It's kind of like, it's actually almost a London tradition, or are they just kind of, they're sticking their heads in the sand and they're coming up with really emotive arguments about risk and safety that probably aren't. Nobody spoke to me about driverless cars. They were concerned about Uber. They were fixed on what does the next 18 months look like. They weren't thinking, actually, in 3 or 4 years, this conversation's redundant. Because if you've got a choice between getting in an Uber or a taxi that's driven by someone who might be tired, that's driven by someone who you might not trust and you don't know, or you've got a choice to get in a car that's programmed to keep you safe and doesn't get tired, which one are you going to take? You're always going to take the one that keeps you safe. And they're not looking that far ahead. And that for them is a 3 or 4 year window. It's not massive. That will happen. The trials and pilots are happening now. But the challenge to us is to think about that on an economic scale. And I think actually as HR professionals, one of the things that hasn't been a hallmark of our profession and should be, is looking externally first. What's happening in the broader economy? What's happening out there in the world? How will that impact organisations? Too often we kind of start from what's happening in the organisation. It's to look externally, look at the changes that are likely in the next 5 to 10 years. And I genuinely, whilst it may sound like nightmare scenarios to people in this room, they're all plausible scenarios. I've given you nothing tonight that isn't either based on research or based on things that are already happening. It's to look across that horizon and from that point say, what does that mean for us professionals and what do we need to do next? Because if we don't make those decisions now and don't start thinking about those issues now, it's going to be too late. Because actually our jobs will be some of the first to go. If you're worried about your HR department being outsourced to a robot might be a good option in the next 3 or 4 years. If you want a dispassionate view of what's happened in a disciplinary incident, if you want to know whether someone was lying or not, well, that's fine, we can look at what happened to their heartbeat.
I'm very curious at the point that you've arrived in your talk about the ethics and who you think holds the ethical card about where these designs and how algorithms speak on the case notes. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on where does the ethics of this lie.
It's a really interesting question because I think there are a number of stakeholders. So the way I describe, because people that I grew up with, well, that's too strong. It's not like my mum told me when I came out of the womb, but the kind of HR is the moral compass of the organisation. I think it's a really dangerous place to be. I think HR's job is in part to ensure that the organisation has a moral compass. I think having an HR director that is hugely ethical and the rest of the board don't care doesn't normally end up in a really good place. So I think we have responsibility for education within it. We have responsibility for checking the ethics and backgrounds of suppliers that we may work with. And we have responsibility for thinking through the ramifications of decisions that we make, but also thinking broadly across the business and challenging back on that. So there are a couple of examples that I kind of use. So some of the technology, people won't understand the ramifications of even the everyday text. So Facebook's done a couple of experiments, quite famously, that are really dubious in terms of ethics. And Facebook have had to apologise, so I'm not kind of speaking out of turn about them. So one of them was they adjusted people's timelines to give them a different bias of happy or sad stories to see whether that made people happier or sad. So that is Facebook playing about with people's mood, but with no checks, no sign-off, nothing like that. These are just trials. They're kicking about in the lab and they go, hey, I wonder if we can make someone depressed, or I wonder if we can make someone happy. Let's go do it. No control in that process. Google, people kind of, I love Google, I'm a big Googleophile. And any company that has don't be evil as their kind of internal mantra, I'm a big fan of that. But even they're not perfect. So if you and I did it, they've tried to sort out the algorithm, but if you and I did a search for jobs, about 18 months ago, just by virtue of being a man, because it's normally tied to your Google profile as I'd get higher paid jobs coming in. So the sidebars and all the adverts and everything that's being fed in terms of market intelligence, just by virtue of a man, I'd have different jobs coming in. So if you think about the embedding of a discriminatory process through that, you don't even know about the opportunities that I do at a higher level, simply because of gender. And that's because no one's checked the algorithm to almost write it for that fact. So we have gender inequality. So it's assuming that most women would be looking at jobs at a lower level. So it's producing results at that level. But because no one's thought that through and gone, actually, should there be a check and balance in that? Should we write that system? It was only when a piece of research was done that they kind of found that out. And that's the kind of challenge that's about sophistication of technology, that one, we need to get better educated about as kind of as a function. We need to keep on top of. But two, we need to understand those ramifications within organisations as to how people feel. There's a lot about data security, but there's a lot about data treatment as well, and we're just not there yet.
Your price you're paying for your flight will depend on what you've searched from the last 6 search engines. So you want to find a cheap flight, go on your kid's iPad that's been Googling Barney the dinosaur, or whatever his name is, and you'll get much cheaper flights on your kid's computer than you will on your own. Is that ethical?
I love that it's turned into a consumer tips section, by the way, so if anyone didn't know that, cheap flights come out. Is it ethical? It's discriminatory pricing. I think that's slightly different to the challenge of job searching. And actually, I'll be happy to be challenged on someone saying they're exactly the same. But I think there's something, one is, we kind of understand you as a consumer. It's a bit like being a different quote when you walk into a garage. They kind of size you up and think, well, actually, maybe it's a transfer. Probably not ethical. I think it's a part of a different dimension of problem to half of the human race not being able to have access to the same opportunities because the search engine is deselecting that information for them. Because you're going to it as a broker of information in a really clear way, in a trusted way, which is similar to the flights, but I think the impact is disproportionately more. So yeah, it's part of the same technology coin, which is coming back to kind of that example about us only understanding the tip of it. So other people have built it, we don't understand how it fits together. That's the challenge. So Tim Harford, who's well worth reading if you don't already. So the Undercover Economist, written quite a few books. In Adapt, he talks about the complexity of where we've reached and the fact we can't understand or compute it. And there was a student who tried to put together a toaster from scratch. Yeah, just like a toaster, like not a complicated toaster, a kind of that you get for £5 in Asda, the kind of like student toaster. And just put all those parts together. But they don't exist. We're an economy and we're a society that patches stuff together to get a result. It took him about 12 months, and when he put it together, there's a photo, and it does not look like a toaster. And when he switched it on, it did not react like a toaster, and just turned into kind of a multi-blob of plastic. But actually, the complexity of the world around you, I'm going to go really old school here, which is Mark Twain wrote a short story called Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and it was about someone getting teleported back from Mark Twain's time to King Arthur's time, and they were treated like a wizard because of all the things they could do. So they kind of had an insight into technology and how it worked, and they could make things happen. We're no longer a particularly practical race. Like, we just don't do that stuff. If someone teleported me back to King Arthur's time, I'd just die really quickly. I would have nothing to offer them. I'd go, well, electricity, I'm not entirely sure how that works. There's Ben Franklin came out, like there was a kite and some lightning and a key. I don't really get it. And I got like oil, and I could describe cars, but I couldn't. Like if I went cars, you know, they take you from place to place and they work through. I don't know. It's a complex world. I couldn't tell you how to build that chair. Like I very much doubt someone whittled it with their own hands. Like it's a complex array of stuff made through various industrial processes. And there's a distance from it, and our relationship with technology is very similar to that, in that it's created by very, very clever people working, basing their work on other very, very clever people's work, and other people's work. So actually, quite often, no one understands how the whole thing fits together. They just know that the last bit they plugged in works, because not much is being ground up. It's stuff like GitHub, which is kind of a universal code kind of repository, where people dump code and other people use it. And GitHub's a really, it's another really good example, tangential. So coding, if anyone kind of knows about it, is a pretty much a male preserve. It's a really difficult profession for women to break into. So the tech companies that kind of really deal in code, and if you ask Mark Zuckerberg about what Facebook do, they go, we code really well. They don't talk about like the big mission statement, they go, we code better than anyone else. There was an experiment run about 6 months ago, and they are not, you have to, you basically leave a tag on your code on GitHub and say who's done it. And they found that if you remove that tag, women's code's better. Women just code better than men. So basically the code that was then lifted and dropped to be utilised in the world, women were about 3% better. It was actually quite significant given the volume of that. As soon as you put the women's names on it and the man's names on it, people choose the men's code. But it's a really strange phenomenon, but actually we discriminate down to that level. But I feel more comfortable with men in technology. Sorry, there was a...
I was a programmer at one point. The bit that I'm very, very excited by is the whole idea that we are actually needing to adapt in a funny sort of way. We have to adapt, perhaps in the way that our prehistoric ancestors did, and that we would have to respond to our environment and learn from our environment in real time. Are there any organisations that you're very excited to see are doing some very dynamic work in adapting to their staff or enabling their staff to really move forward in this new age?
Do you know what I think is really interesting? It may not come from the angle that you kind of think. There are quite a few companies that are now taking a really revolutionary stance on flexible working. So whether that's the results-only work environments where it doesn't, I'll see you once a month, as long as you've got your stuff done, I don't mind if you're at the golf course, if you've kind of spent lunch over. I think that's fundamentally a change of the traditional kind of tailorist employment contract of kind of fixed terms. That's really exciting. Economies that are now talking about shifting down to 3-day weeks. So there's a state in the US that's kind of shifting towards that, and then I think it's one of the Northern European countries, I think it may be Denmark, where they've shifted, it's a town that started it, it's now kind of catching on. They shifted their working day to 8 to 3, and then just everyone goes home at 3 o'clock. France, I don't know if anyone saw yesterday, France has just passed a law that means it's okay to ignore emails that are sent out of hours, which I kind of love. There's something typically French about that, but you can just kind of give it, in arrived after hours, I will give it a Gallic shrug. This is an after hours one. So I think you're seeing some stuff that's actually happening at the right level, which I think is actually government and legislation has a real role to play in this. Because to expect every organisation, particularly as a bias shift towards SMEs, to wrestle with these problems is hugely, hugely difficult. But I think the government has a role to step into it with a degree of societal care to make sure that we're not all about efficiency, but we're about quality of life. And I think one of the things we focus on, and one of the things you'll hear most about, is productivity in this country and how we lag behind other countries. What we don't hear enough about this narrative is, like, do we have a better standard of living? Are we happier? That's kind of a key. Look, we all want to be happy, don't we? We're 23rd, the stats published today, 23rd in global happiness. Now, you can either look at that and go, 23rd, that's rubbish. And if you do that, we slip to 24th. So please don't do that. Like, if you get depressed about that, we get it wrong way. Or you can go, actually, we're the 23rd happiest place to live on Earth. And I don't know how many people were kind of born in the UK, but if you did, that's the right end of the lottery to kind of draw your ticket. To live in a fantastic city like this, 23rd happiest place on Earth. But I think there are governmental decisions that need to be made to kind of answer your question. Because I think individual companies, they're after competitive advantage, and that's a healthy thing to be after. I have no problem with the profit motives, but actually we're talking about sustainability of organisations more and more, but also sustainability of society, and there are some societal choices that fit. And I think what's been interesting, the rights or wrongs of the living wage conversations, and I'm not making a comment on whether it's at the right level or anything like that, is that you're seeing the government stepping, I think, more firmly into spaces where they're regulating the labour market to ensure equality of life comes from labour, and I think that's a healthy thing, I think. And again, there's part of me as an economist, or ex-economist, or bad economist, that kind of goes, actually you need to look at the net gains and you won't know until it's found out. But I think policy making that looks at that industrial level is a really interesting place to be, because I think there's a difference between a free market and a reckless market, and I think we need to make sure that we have enough interventions to make sure that business has some form of societal good, because otherwise what you could have is this narrowing of the work base and the number of people that can be employed, and accruing of wealth through a really narrow group. And actually, I'm not a communist at heart, but I kind of want to see everyone out there doing okay as a level base, and I think that's a healthy place to live.
So do you think that it's the short-termism of our capitalism that creates these decisions that aren't? It's all very well saying that the government needs to improve, but maybe if capitalism had a slightly longer-term view, we wouldn't need governmental pressure because we'd be focused on how we can keep our people happy and engaged. Because I'm still going to need them intelligence, even if they're working in roles and other robot design.
All of those things. I think if you look at the average tenure of a CEO, it's come down to such a low level that it's really difficult to get them thinking about legacy. Or it kind of, I suppose that would be too harsh. The best ones obviously do. But I remember speaking to someone who did some of the original research with, does everyone know kind of the Jack Welch kind of straight from the gut, the rank and yank and the get rid of the top, get rid of the bottom 10% and all that kind of stuff. People Factory, he was actually part of the research team that delivered that for GE at the time. And they did a lot of studies with CEOs to come up with the kind of formula of what made a successful organisation. He said when he did it in the US in the 70s and 80s, so he was working, and the average tenure, he said, of a CEO then was kind of over a decade. He said that kind of like you were chatting to someone and you could come back in 3 years' time, and it would be rare if it wasn't the same person. We're now looking at kind of a couple of years or under. You come in, you get a short-term market bump, you probably do a cultural change program, and then you head off to your next role. And that creates a sustainability problem. And financial services is a really interesting one, because what's happening now, so I've spent some time in some of the larger FS firms, and what's really pleasing to see is some examples of attempting to instill some really long-term thinking within those mechanics and within the culture. So if you go to Barclays, Canary Wharf, and you kind of walk through, you have to walk through a giant thing on stewardship. Now we know from the financial crisis that walking past a giant thing on stewardship is probably not going to avoid it, but the sentiment and the accent and the emphasis is right. If you go to RBS, and all over the place, they have a list of rules that you have to utilise in decision making, and one of them is, will this decision still look good in 5 years' time? I think if more organisations can start taking that longer term view, and even if when the CEO comes in, what they're doing is, I'm here for a short time, but what I'm going to do is ensure that longer term view, that's healthy. But there's again, when it goes back to regulation and things like that, there's things like quarterly reporting of businesses that automatically mean they're chasing short term results, and looking at how we could change some of the governance around that and the expectations around that, I think would be really interesting. Because there's something about if as soon as you've just done your last sprint, you're into your next sprint, you're never thinking about, how do I run that long race, and how do I make sure that people are okay on the other side of it. So it's a fascinating question. If I had the answers, I'd probably be running one of the august institutions behind us. But I think, broadly speaking, there's a bit for regulation, but there's also a bit of more requirement and expectation of senior teams. I think that's fine and healthy. So I always think the one thing that HR talks to senior teams about least is legacy, but also ego. Like, hit them really hard in the ego. Like, is this what you want to leave behind? Is that how you want to be seen? And we don't do that enough because we've got a narrative that we need to go to them with spreadsheets, and we need to go to them with pure commercials and things like that. But I've seen great commercial cases get thrown out because they just didn't fancy it. But I've seen things that hit senior teams in the gut go through because they just think it's the right thing to do, and they're going to make that happen. And I think it's not binary. I think we need both approaches, but I think we've gone slightly too far down we need to just, go with the commercial approach. I remember speaking to a head of sales once, and it was earlier in my career, so it was kind of like dealing quite a micro level, and I was saying, you've got a bullying problem. And he went, if you can tell me how much it's costing me, I'll know whether I need to deal with it or not. And you go, at that point, you've lost sight of kind of what you're there to do, because it's all about the commercials. And I think it's really important that as a profession, one of the things we go forward with is embracing genuine principles at the heart of what we do. which is we aren't just there to serve business, we're there to make sure businesses are successful and to enable business growth. And part of that is Southwest Airlines they've operated to a triple bottom line for years, which is customer, shareholder and employee. And they believe that those things aren't mutually exclusive things to serve. But if you look after your customers to the absence of the business, your business goes under. But likewise, if you look after just pleasing your shareholders, you probably don't have sustainability in the other areas. So I think that triple bottom line approach and championing that is a good space for us.
How do you see businesses actually changing their culture? Because you've got financial services culture that's over 100 years old. And perhaps some businesses are actually born in a particular way, like John Lewis Partnership, that was born with that particular concept. So how do you see organisations actually changing their culture?
So there's a sinister answer to this, which is some of them will just die out. Not necessarily the ones that you've mentioned, but actually we are operating in a relatively agile environment, and size is no longer the only differentiator, because we know that, well, some of the things around VUCA and that language are probably overstated. What is true is that the journey to sizable market capitalisation has never been shorter, and tech companies are leading the way in that space. John Lewis are going through a large cultural change programme at the moment, based around actually some of the stuff that we've talked about tonight. So if you go into if you think about how you used to interact with retail, you used to go in and you ask someone for help about a product. Now what you do is you research it at home, you work out which product you want, and then you go to a retailer, or you get Amazon to deliver it to you. They've got a real challenge around that, as to that partnership model was kind of based around the excellence of delivery and the excellence of their people. What does that look like in a kind of future world? So John Lewis Online is obviously massive for them. Saw them invest in Ocado and kind of have that relationship. So they're going through change. Financial services is a really interesting one. So I can tell you a partial biased narrative from my time at Metro Bank, which is Metro Bank was set up under the premise that none of the other banks would be able to respond to it. They could clone what was happening in terms of technology. They could change the working hours, they could change the layout of the banks, but they couldn't replicate starting a company from scratch and choosing people who really wanted to serve people and change banking. But I've seen some really positive stuff in Barclays. Some really positive stuff in Barclays over the last 6 to 12 months. That gives me faith actually that some of the larger institutions are making change. I think it takes longer, but I guess one of the things they have as an advantage is that they have a critical mass which gives them sustainability. So it might be that you see a gradual erosion of market share, then it picks back up. There are lots of things that could happen, but I think changing culture is one of the hardest things. Changing an embedded culture is really, really tough. So if you speak to anyone who works in the major banks about removing performance management, they're all for it, but they have not got a clue to start, because the entire organisation is based on, what have you done, therefore that's what you get paid. So it's a massive shift, but I think they're facing into it really, really well. And we've been involving at the CIPD most of those large organisations in some of those conversations around culture, because the other thing they're starting to do is talk to each other about how they can do it. And that shows a kind of shared ambition to be different, which can only be healthy for, I think, the economy as a whole. Mark? Do I need to stop?
David, I think
get thrown off.
it's been a fascinating talk. I think we're going to have to time out. But can you stay with us for a drink?
Yes, absolutely. So if someone wanted to ask a question and I didn't get to it, then is it on film or TV? Then I'll pop out.
Is it really quick?
The whole economic argument, though, is take hospitality in Ireland, largest employer as an industry, take that 25% of it, and exploit so many other businesses in rural areas with low skilled workforce. What do they do?
I don't know if I came across to anyone in the room that's knowing what they do. I don't know. And that's kind of like, we need to start working on that now. And that's why I say it's a combination of business and government and the people in this room actually giving it some thought. Because there are entire industries, entire regions that will get hollowed out. So if you think about a coal mining village in Wales and what that looked like 60 or 70 years ago and what that looks like now, completely different. Think about what that kind of levelling out looks like for different areas. It's harder to rent out space in Canary Wharf than for Leeds, because people are kind of moving out to dynamics of the economy is changing, we need to respond.
David, thank you. Really interesting. Just before we break for a glass of wine and some food, just a couple of dates for your diary. April the 20th is our next event in the evening. We're going to hear about engagement. We're going to hear about engagement from an HR director who spent a lot of time in the hospitality industry, places like Maison, Rochester Collection, joined by consultancy Purple Cube and by Jane Sunley, and we're talking about what really works in terms of engagement in our industry. I think will be fascinating talk. Hot off the press also, I can say that we have an event now scheduled for the 7th of June, which is our first panel debate with our new academic sponsors, King College London. We recently replaced the LSE as our academic sponsor, and the debate is going to be on the topic of gender and gender pay. So very topical, as you know, that's something which is very much on the governmental agenda going forward. So 2 events for your diary. Hope you can join us now for a glass of